Lonely Lumberjack gave his last bread to a widow and 3 orphans. That night, he found the family he needed. In 1887, a broken man walked into a frontier town with nothing but his last loaf of bread, and what happened next will shatter your heart and rebuild it again. Tom McCready had been living alone in the Montana wilderness for 7 years, haunted by a tragedy so devastating it drove him from civilization. But when he met a desperate widow with 3 starving children, he made a choice that would either destroy him completely, or teach him that some families are born not from blood, but from the courage to give everything away. The axe bit deep into pine, and Tom McCready felt the familiar ache travel up his arms like an old friend returning. Dawn light filtered through the Montana wilderness, painting everything the color of ash and memory. He had been swinging this same axe for 7 years now, ever since he built his cabin with hands that shook from more than just the cold. The rhythm never changed: lift, swing, split. Lift, swing, split. It was a prayer he could say without words, a way to fill the silence that pressed against his chest like a stone. His breath came out in white puffs that disappeared before they had a chance to mean anything. The pile of split wood grew beside him, each piece cut clean and straight. Tom had always been good with his hands. Sarah used to say that. Sarah used to say a lot of things, back when there was someone to listen. The cabin sat 20 yards away, smoke rising from its chimney in a thin gray line. From where he stood, Tom could see through the single window to the table inside. 1 chair, 1 plate, 1 cup. He had built the table big enough for 4, back when he still believed in tomorrow. Now it just made the loneliness echo louder. His stomach growled, pulling him back to the present. Tom set down the axe and walked to the cabin, his boots crunching on frost-covered ground. Inside, the warmth hit him like a gentle hand on his shoulder. He opened the wooden cupboard and counted what he had left. Half a loaf of bread, going stale. A small sack of flour, maybe enough for 2 more loaves if he was careful. Some dried beans that rattled like pebbles in their jar. Winter was coming early this year, and his supplies were running thin. He had always been careful about trips to town. Willow Creek sat 15 miles south through rough country, and Tom made the journey maybe 3 times a year. People there knew him as the quiet man who lived alone in the mountains. They bought his firewood and paid him fair prices, but they didn't ask questions about why a man would choose to live so far from other souls. Tom preferred it that way. But now, with his stomach hollow and winter pressing close, he would have to make the ride. He wrapped the half loaf of bread in cloth and tucked it into his saddlebag along with what little money he had saved. The brown horse, Buck, nickered softly when Tom approached with the saddle. Buck had been with him almost as long as the axe, and like the axe, he never asked for more than Tom could give. The ride to Willow Creek took most of the morning. Tom let Buck pick his own pace through the pine forests and rocky slopes. They passed streams that ran quick and clear, heading toward winter's freeze. The air smelled of snow and dying leaves. Tom tried not to think about how quiet the world had become, how even the birds seemed to save their songs for someone else. Willow Creek wasn't much of a town, just a handful of buildings clustered around a single dirt road. The general store sat on the main corner, its windows glowing yellow in the afternoon light. Tom tied Buck to the hitching post and stepped up onto the wooden sidewalk. His boots made hollow sounds on the planks. Inside the store, the air was warm and thick with the smell of coffee and tobacco. Old Pete behind the counter nodded when Tom walked in. They had done business before, but neither man was much for talking. Tom picked up a small sack of flour and some dried meat. The prices had gone up since his last visit, and what little money he had wouldn't stretch as far as he had hoped. He was counting coins in his palm when he heard it, a woman's voice, thin and desperate, talking to Pete about credit and winter coming and 3 children to feed. Tom looked up to see a woman in a faded blue dress standing at the counter. Her hands shook as she spoke. Her face was pale, marked by the kind of worry that had been wearing on her for months. Behind her stood 3 children. The oldest was maybe 10, a boy with serious eyes and patches on his knees. The middle child was a girl, perhaps 7, holding tight to a corn-husk doll with half its hair missing. The youngest was a boy who couldn't have been more than 4, leaning against his mother's skirt like it was the only safe place in the world. Tom found himself listening to words that cut through him like cold wind. The woman's husband had died in a logging accident 2 months back. She had been trying to make ends meet with sewing and washing clothes, but winter was coming and she had nothing left. No flour, no meat, no way to keep her children warm when the snow started falling in earnest. Pete's voice was gentle but firm. He couldn't extend any more credit. He had his own family to think about, his own bills to pay. The woman's shoulders sagged like she was carrying a weight too heavy for her bones. Tom watched the oldest boy put his hand on his mother's arm, trying to comfort her in a way that made Tom's chest tight. That was when Tom saw himself clearly for the first time in years. Here he was, counting coins and worrying about his own empty belly, while this woman stood 3 feet away with children who were probably hungrier than he had ever been. The bread in his saddlebag felt suddenly heavy, like it was pulling at his conscience. He stepped forward before he could change his mind. His voice came out rough from disuse. "Ma'am," he said, and the woman turned. Her eyes were blue and tired, the kind of tired that sleep couldn't fix. "I couldn't help but hear. I've got some things I don't need." Tom paid for his small sack of flour, then walked outside. The woman followed with her children, uncertainty written across her face. At Buck's side, Tom opened his saddlebag and pulled out the wrapped loaf of bread. It wasn't much, but it was all he had. He held it out to her. "For the children," he said simply. The woman stared at the bread like she couldn't believe it was real. When she took it, her fingers brushed his, and Tom felt something he hadn't felt in years, the simple warmth of human contact. "Thank you," she whispered, and Tom could hear that she meant it all the way down to her bones. "I'm Mary Carson. These are my children, Johnny, Lucy, and little Samuel." Tom nodded to each of them. The youngest boy, Samuel, peeked out from behind his mother's skirt to look at Tom with wide, curious eyes. "I'm Tom McCready," he said. It felt strange to say his name out loud to someone who wasn't Pete at the store. Mary Carson held the bread against her chest like it was made of gold. "How can I repay you?" she asked. Tom was already turning back to Buck, already preparing to ride away from this moment before it could mean too much. "You don't owe me anything," he said over his shoulder. "Just take care of those children." As Tom rode out of Willow Creek, he could feel their eyes following him until he disappeared around the bend. The ride home felt longer somehow, and the emptiness in his stomach had grown teeth. But there was something else there too, something he hadn't felt in so long he had almost forgotten its name. It might have been satisfaction, or it might have been something closer to peace. The cabin waited for him in the gathering dusk, smoke still rising from the chimney, the table still set for one. Tom unsaddled Buck and fed him the last of the oats. Inside, he made a thin soup from the dried meat and tried not to think about the bread that would have filled the hollow spaces. But as he sat at his too-big table with his single bowl, Tom found himself wondering what Mary Carson was telling her children about the stranger who had given them his last loaf. That night, as wind rattled the windows and spoke of the winter to come, Tom lay in his narrow bed and listened to the silence. For the first time in years, it didn't sound quite so empty. Somewhere in the darkness, he could almost hear the echo of a child's laughter, the rustle of a corn-husk doll, the whispered prayers of a mother who had been shown kindness by a stranger. Tom closed his eyes and tried to remember what it felt like to matter to someone, even if it was just for the space of time it took to hand over a loaf of bread. Tom's hand stayed steady as he watched Mary Carson tear the loaf into pieces for her children. The bread looked smaller once it was broken apart, but somehow it seemed to multiply in the children's hands, each piece precious as gold, each crumb a small miracle. Little Samuel bit into his portion with the careful reverence of someone who understood hunger in ways a 4-year-old never should. The afternoon light was fading, painting Willow Creek's dusty main street in shades of amber and shadow. Tom should have been riding back toward his cabin by now, but something held him there beside Buck's patient flank, watching this family share what he had given them. The oldest boy, Johnny, broke off a piece of his bread and handed it to his mother, who shook her head and tried to give it back. But Johnny was insistent, his young face serious with the weight of being the man of the family too soon. Mary Carson's eyes met Tom's across the space between them, and he saw something there that made his chest tight. Gratitude, yes, but something deeper. Recognition, maybe. As if she could see past the rough beard and worn clothes to the man who had once known how to care for people, who had once set a table for more than just himself. "Mr. McCready," she said, her voice soft as falling leaves. "You've given us more than food. You've given us hope." Tom looked away quickly, uncomfortable with the weight of her words. Hope was a dangerous thing to carry. He had learned that years ago. Hope was what had built that too-big table in his cabin. Hope was what had planted the vegetable garden that now grew wild with weeds. Hope was what had killed Sarah and the baby she carried, when the fever came that terrible winter and there was no doctor within 50 miles. "It's just bread," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. But Mary Carson smiled, and it transformed her tired face into something beautiful. "No," she said gently, "it's kindness. And kindness is never just anything." The children had finished eating, and little Lucy was carefully folding the cloth that had wrapped the loaf. She approached Tom with shy steps, holding it out to him. "Thank you, mister," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the evening wind that was beginning to stir the dust at their feet. Tom took the cloth, and his fingers brushed the little girl's hand. Her skin was soft and warm, alive in a way that made something in his chest crack open. He had forgotten what it felt like to touch someone who wasn't afraid of him, someone who looked at him and saw something worth trusting. "You keep that," he told Lucy, gently pushing the cloth back toward her. "Might come in handy." The child's eyes widened, and she clutched the cloth to her chest like it was a treasure. Behind her, Johnny and Samuel watched Tom with the careful attention children gave to adults they were trying to understand. Tom realized they were memorizing him, storing away the details of the man who had appeared in their hunger and offered what he could spare. The first snowflake landed on Tom's hat, delicate as a whispered prayer. Then another, and another. Winter was announcing itself, gentle at first but full of promises that would turn harsh before long. Tom looked up at the darkening sky and felt the familiar knot of worry settle in his stomach. The Carson family had shelter for now, but when the real cold came, when the snow piled high and the wind turned bitter, what then? "You'd better get inside," he told Mary, nodding toward the thin walls of whatever boarding house or shed they were calling home. "Snow's starting." Mary gathered her children with practiced efficiency, but she paused before turning away. "Mr. McCready," she said, and there was something in her voice that made Tom look at her despite himself. If you ever need anything, a meal, conversation, you're always welcome." The invitation hung in the air between them like those first snowflakes, fragile and unexpected. Tom felt something stir in his chest, something that had been sleeping so long he had forgotten it was there. The desire to say yes. The longing to sit at a table where voices filled the corners instead of silence. The ache to matter to someone again. But wanting something and being worthy of it were two different things entirely. "That's kind of you," he said, touching the brim of his hat. "You take care of yourself, Mrs. Carson. And those children." Tom mounted Buck and turned toward home without looking back. He told himself it was because the snow was getting heavier, because the trail would be harder to follow in the dark. But really it was because he couldn't bear to see Mary Carson's face as he rode away. Couldn't bear the disappointment that would creep into her eyes when she realized he was just a man who gave away bread and disappeared, not someone who stayed around long enough to mean anything. The ride back to his cabin passed in a blur of falling snow and gathering darkness. Buck knew the way by heart, picking his path through the pine trees with the sure steps of a horse who had made this journey countless times. Tom let his mind wander, and it went places he usually kept locked away. He thought about Sarah, the way she used to laugh when flour got in her hair while she was baking. He thought about the baby they had named Grace in whispered conversations, the baby who never took a breath outside her mother's womb. He thought about the fever that had come with the blizzard 7 years ago, the fever that had taken them both while Tom sat helpless beside their bed, watching everything he loved slip away like snow melting in his palms. After that, he had packed away the extra plates and chairs, had let the garden go wild, had spoken to no one unless he absolutely had to. It was easier that way, safer. You couldn't lose what you never let yourself have. But today, watching Mary Carson's children eat the bread he had given them, Tom had remembered something he thought he had buried for good. He had remembered what it felt like to matter. To be the answer to someone's prayer instead of just another mouth to feed. To see gratitude light up a face and know that he had put it there. The cabin appeared through the swirling snow like a ghost of itself, windows glowing yellow with lamplight he had left burning. Tom unsaddled Buck and got him settled in the small lean-to with extra hay and a blanket. The horse nuzzled his shoulder, a gesture of affection that Tom accepted without pulling away. Maybe he was getting soft in his old age. Inside the cabin, the warmth hit him like a physical thing. He built up the fire and put water on to boil, then stood looking at his table. One chair, one plate, one cup. The sight of it used to bring him peace, or at least resignation. Tonight it just looked lonely. Tom made himself a thin soup from the dried meat he had bought, stretching it with water and a few wild onions he had stored from summer. His stomach growled, reminding him that he had given away his supper along with his bread. But every time hunger gnawed at him, he thought of little Samuel's wide eyes, of Lucy's careful folding of the cloth, of Johnny trying to give his mother part of his portion. Outside, the snow was falling harder now, whispering against the windows with a sound like secrets being told. Tom sat at his table and tried to eat his meager soup, but his mind kept drifting back to Willow Creek. Were Mary Carson and her children warm enough? Did they have enough blankets? Enough wood for their fire? He pushed the thoughts away, but they kept coming back like smoke finding its way through cracks in a chimney. This was how it started, he knew. This was how you began to care again, and caring was the first step toward losing everything that mattered. Tom finished his soup and cleaned his single bowl, then sat by the fire with his hands folded in his lap. The flames danced and flickered, casting shadows that seemed to move like people he used to know. He could almost see Sarah sitting in the chair that wasn't there anymore, her hands busy with mending while she told him about her day. He could almost hear Grace's first cry, the sound that had never come but that he had imagined so many times it felt like memory. The snow kept falling, building up on the windowsills, promising a long winter ahead. Tom closed his eyes and tried to find the peace that solitude usually brought him. But peace seemed farther away tonight, lost somewhere between Mary Carson's grateful smile and the empty chair where Sarah used to sit. When he finally went to bed, Tom lay awake listening to the wind howl around the cabin's corners. He thought about 3 children sleeping somewhere in Willow Creek, hopefully warm, hopefully safe. He thought about their mother lying awake too, probably worrying about tomorrow and the day after that and all the days of winter still to come. Somewhere in the darkness between sleeping and waking, Tom made a decision that scared him more than the loneliness ever had. If Mary Carson and her children made it through this winter, if they were still in Willow Creek come spring, maybe he would take her up on that invitation for a meal. Maybe he would remember how to sit at a table where conversation filled the silence. But first, they all had to survive what was coming. And as the snow piled deeper outside his windows, Tom wondered if kindness alone would be enough to keep them alive when the real cold arrived. The storm had been raging for 3 days when Tom woke to find his world had turned white and silent. Snow had piled against his windows like nature's own curtains, blocking out the sun and leaving him in a twilight that never seemed to end. The wind howled around the cabin's corners with voices that sounded almost human, and Tom found himself listening for words in the endless conversation between winter and wood. His stomach had stopped growling somewhere during the 2nd day. Now it just ached, a hollow burning that reminded him with each breath that he had given away his last real meal. The thin soup he had been stretching for 3 days was more memory than substance now, just hot water flavored with the ghost of dried meat and wild onions that had run out yesterday. Tom sat at his table, staring at the single empty bowl, and tried to remember what Sarah used to say about lean times. Something about how the Lord provided for those who provided for others. But Sarah had been full of faith in ways that Tom had never quite managed, even when she was alive to share that faith with. Now, with hunger making his thoughts slow and strange, her words felt as distant as summer. He pushed himself up from the chair, his legs unsteady beneath him. The axe waited by the door, and there was still wood that needed splitting. The storm might last another day or week, but the fire couldn't be allowed to die. Tom pulled on his coat and stepped out into the white world that had swallowed his familiar landscape. The cold hit him like a physical blow, stealing his breath and making his eyes water. Snow fell in thick, wet flakes that clung to his beard and turned to ice before he could brush them away. The woodpile sat buried under 3 feet of white, and Tom had to dig with his bare hands to find the logs he had split just days ago. His movements were slow and clumsy. The axe felt heavier than it ever had, and his first swing went wide, sending vibrations up his arms that made his teeth ache. Tom steadied himself and tried again. The blade bit into frozen pine, but without his usual force behind it. He was weaker than he wanted to admit, weaker than he had been since those dark months after Sarah died when he forgot how to eat regular meals. By the time he had split enough wood to last the day, Tom's vision was swimming with exhaustion. He carried the logs inside armload by armload, his breath coming in ragged gasps that turned to steam in the cold air. The cabin felt smaller somehow, as if the storm was pressing in on all sides, squeezing his world down to just these few rooms and the slowly dying fire. Tom built up the flames and sat close to the hearth, holding his shaking hands out to the warmth. The heat felt good against his skin, but it couldn't touch the cold that had settled deep in his bones. He closed his eyes and tried to think about something other than the emptiness in his belly, but his mind kept drifting to Mary Carson and her children. Were they warm enough? Did they have food to last through this storm? The thought of those 3 children going hungry while he sat here feeling sorry for himself made Tom push himself back to his feet. There had to be something in the cabin he could eat. Some forgotten can or overlooked sack of grain tucked away in a corner. He searched the cupboards again, running his hands along shelves he had already emptied twice. Nothing but dust and the lingering smell of better times. In the back of the bottom cupboard, his fingers found something he had forgotten. A small tin of peaches that Sarah had put up the summer before she died. Tom pulled it out with trembling hands, staring at her careful handwriting on the label. Peaches, summer 1880. 7 years old, but the tin looked solid, no rust or swelling. He had been saving it without really knowing why, some part of him unwilling to consume this last piece of the life they had shared. Tom opened the tin with his knife, and the sweet smell that rose from inside made his mouth water so suddenly it hurt. The peaches were soft and golden, floating in syrup that had darkened with age but still smelled like sunshine. He ate them slowly, savoring each bite, feeling the sugar spread through his bloodstream like liquid warmth. It wasn't much, but it was enough to quiet the worst of the hunger pangs and clear his head. That night, as the storm continued its assault on the cabin walls, Tom lay in his narrow bed and listened to the wind tell its stories. Sometimes it sounded like Sarah's voice, calling his name from somewhere far away. Sometimes it sounded like children laughing, the way Johnny and Lucy and little Samuel might sound if they were warm and safe and fed. Tom pulled his thin blanket closer and tried not to think about how much wood he had left, or what he would do if the storm lasted much longer. He woke to silence. The wind had stopped sometime before dawn, leaving behind a stillness so complete it seemed to ring in his ears. Tom lay in bed for a moment, almost afraid to move, as if any sound might bring the storm back. Then he heard it, a voice, small and distant, calling through the snow. "Hello, hello, is anybody there?" Tom sat up so quickly his head spun. The voice came again, clearer this time, and definitely real. A child's voice, high and sweet and desperate. Tom stumbled out of bed, pulling on his boots and coat as he moved toward the door. His hands shook as he lifted the latch, and not just from the cold. The door opened on a world transformed. Snow had drifted against the cabin until it reached nearly to the windows, creating smooth white hills where his familiar landscape used to be. The sky was clear and pale blue, and the morning sun turned everything into a field of diamonds. But what made Tom's breath catch in his throat were the footprints, small footprints, no bigger than his hand, leading up to his door through snow that came almost to a child's waist. "Lucy," he called out, his voice rusty from days of silence. A small figure appeared from behind a snow-covered pine tree, waving frantically. Lucy Carson, bundled in what looked like every piece of clothing she owned, her cheeks red with cold but her eyes bright with relief. Behind her came Johnny, carrying little Samuel on his back, all three of them fighting their way through drifts that were taller than the youngest boy. "Mr. McCready," Lucy called out, her voice thin but joyful. "We found you. We brought you soup." Tom stood in his doorway, watching these three children struggle toward his cabin through snow that could have swallowed them entirely, and felt something break open in his chest. They had walked miles through a blizzard, carrying food for him. These children, who had so little, who had been hungry themselves just days ago, had thought of him in his solitude and decided he needed taking care of. He waded out into the snow to meet them, lifting little Samuel into his arms when the boy's short legs could no longer carry him through the drifts. Samuel's face was cold against Tom's neck, but he was smiling, his eyes dancing with the adventure of it all. "Mama made soup," Samuel announced proudly. "And we carried it all the way here without spilling hardly any." Johnny held up a covered pot, steam still rising from under the lid. "She said you might be hungry," he explained, as if walking 15 miles through a blizzard to bring soup to a near stranger was the most natural thing in the world. Tom looked at these three children, at their red cheeks and bright eyes and easy smiles, and felt 7 years of careful isolation crumble like snow in spring sunshine. "You shouldn't have come," he said, but his voice held no scolding, only wonder. "The storm, the cold. You could have gotten lost." Lucy shook her head with the confidence of a child who had never doubted her ability to find what she was looking for. "Mama drew us a map," she said. "And Johnny knows how to read the stars. We knew we'd find you." They had found him indeed. Found him when he was weakest, when his strength was nearly gone and his hope had dwindled down to the faint glow of dying embers. They had found him and brought him soup and smiles and the kind of easy love that asks for nothing in return. Inside the cabin, Tom ladled the soup into bowls, because suddenly he needed more than one. The children sat around his too big table like they belonged there, like the empty chairs had been waiting all these years just for them. The soup was rich with vegetables and chunks of real meat, the kind of meal that spoke of careful planning and generous hearts. "How did you know?" Tom asked as they ate. "How did you know I might need this?" Mary Carson had raised her children well. They looked at each other with the kind of silent communication that families develop, then Johnny spoke for all of them. "Mama said sometimes when people give everything away, they forget to keep anything for themselves. She said that wasn't right, and we should probably check on you." The soup warmed Tom from the inside out, but it was more than the food that filled the empty spaces in his chest. It was the sound of voices in his cabin, the sight of small hands reaching for bread, the easy way these children had claimed space at his table as if love was the only invitation they needed. As the afternoon wore on, Tom found himself telling stories he hadn't spoken aloud in years. Stories about the mountains in summer, about Buck's stubborn personality, about the time he had seen a mother bear teaching her cubs to fish in the stream. The children listened with the complete attention that only children can give, their eyes wide with wonder at this world they were just beginning to discover. When it came time for them to leave, because Mary would worry, because the afternoon was already growing cold, Tom walked them partway back toward town. The snow had settled enough to make the going easier, and the children moved with the boundless energy of the young and well-fed. At the place where the trail split, Tom stopped and looked back toward his cabin, visible through the trees as a small dark shape against all that white. For 7 years, it had been his refuge, his fortress against a world that had taken everything he loved. But now, watching 3 children wave goodbye as they headed home to their mother, Tom realized that fortress walls could become prison walls if you weren't careful. Maybe it was time to remember that there were different kinds of strength. The strength to live alone, yes, but also the strength to let others into the carefully guarded spaces of your heart. Maybe kindness wasn't a weakness that made you vulnerable to loss, but a bridge that connected you to the parts of life that made loss bearable. As Tom walked back toward his cabin, the snow crunching under his boots in the gathering dusk, he found himself thinking about Mary Carson waiting for her children to come home, about the meal she would have ready for them, about the family table where they would sit and share the stories of their day. And for the first time in 7 years, Tom McCready found himself wondering what it would be like to be welcomed at such a table, not as a stranger passing through, but as someone who belonged. The knock came just after dawn, soft but insistent against Tom's door. He had been awake for an hour, sitting by the dying fire and thinking about the children's visit 2 days before. The cabin felt different now, bigger somehow, as if their laughter had pushed back the walls that had been closing in on him for years. Tom opened the door to find Mary Carson standing on his threshold, her breath visible in the cold morning air. She wasn't alone. Behind her stood all 3 children, bundled in coats and scarves, their faces bright with anticipation. But it was Mary herself who captured Tom's attention. She looked different than she had that day in the general store, stronger, more resolved. Her blue eyes held a warmth that chased away the morning chill, and in her hand she carried a large pot that steamed in the cold air. "Mr. McCready," she said, her voice steady despite the flush in her cheeks. "I hope you don't mind the early hour. The children told me about their visit, and I thought you might like some proper company for breakfast." Tom stood in his doorway, acutely aware of his uncombed hair and the stubble on his jaw. He hadn't expected visitors, hadn't prepared himself for the sight of Mary Carson's gentle smile or the way little Samuel peeked out from behind her skirts with eyes full of mischief. For a moment, he nearly stepped back, nearly closed the door on this offer of connection before it could take root. But then Lucy held up a bundle wrapped in clean cloth. "We brought biscuits," she announced proudly. "I helped make them myself. And I carried the butter," Johnny added, showing Tom a small crock cradled carefully in his arms. Without dropping it even once. The simple pride in their voices, the way they looked at him like he was someone worth making biscuits for, broke through Tom's hesitation. He stepped aside and gestured them in, his voice rough with emotion he hadn't expected to feel. "Come in," he said. "All of you. It's too cold to be standing out there." The cabin filled with voices and movement in ways it hadn't for 7 years. Mary set her pot on the table and began ladling out porridge that smelled of cinnamon and honey. The children shed their coats and scarves, draping them over chairs with the casual ownership of people who belong. Lucy unwrapped the biscuits, golden and perfect, while Johnny carefully portioned out butter that was yellow as summer sunshine. Tom watched this domestic ballet with wonder, remembering how Sarah used to move around their kitchen with the same efficient grace. But this was different. Sarah had been his wife, his partner in the careful dance of marriage. Mary Carson was something else entirely, a woman who had chosen to bring her family into his solitude not out of obligation or romance, but out of simple human kindness. "I should have asked first," Mary said as she worked, "before the children came to visit you during the storm. It was presumptuous of me to assume you'd welcome them." Tom shook his head, surprised by her uncertainty. "They saved my life," he said simply. I wasn't doing well. When they arrived with that soup, I'd been without proper food for 3 days." Mary's hand stilled over the serving spoon, and when she looked at him, Tom saw something shift in her expression. Understanding, maybe. Recognition of the kind of loneliness that could make a man forget how to take care of himself. "Then we're even," she said quietly. "Because that bread you gave us kept my children fed for 2 days. And the kindness you showed us reminded me that there are still good people in the world." They sat around Tom's table as the morning light grew stronger outside the windows. For the first time in 7 years, all the chairs were occupied. Tom found himself in the strange position of host, passing the butter and pouring coffee from his single pot into cups Mary had brought from town. The children chattered easily, telling him about their plans for the day, asking him questions about the mountains and the animals that lived in them. Little Samuel had claimed the chair closest to Tom, and he kept reaching over to touch Tom's arm when he talked, as if he needed the physical contact to make sure this giant, quiet man was really listening. Lucy sat across from Tom, her corn-husk doll propped in her lap, occasionally feeding it imaginary bites of biscuit. Johnny, serious and thoughtful like his mother, asked careful questions about chopping wood and caring for horses, as if he was already thinking about the responsibilities he would carry as the man of his small family. "Mr. McCready," Samuel said around a mouthful of porridge, "why do you live all alone up here?" The question hung in the air like morning mist, delicate and impossible to ignore. Tom felt Mary's eyes on him, saw the gentle warning in her expression as she prepared to redirect her son's curiosity. But Tom found himself answering before she could intervene. "I used to live with my wife," he said slowly. "Her name was Sarah. She died 7 years ago, and I guess I just got used to being by myself." Samuel considered this with the gravity that children brought to matters they didn't fully understand. "Was she nice?" he asked. "Very nice," Tom said, his voice soft with memory. "She would have liked you. She always wanted children." The words came out before Tom could stop them, carrying with them the weight of old grief and dreams that had died with Sarah and the baby she carried. But instead of the sharp pain he expected, Tom felt something gentler. Sadness, yes, but also a kind of peace. It felt good to speak Sarah's name aloud, to acknowledge that she had existed, that she had mattered. Mary reached across the table and briefly touched Tom's hand, a gesture so natural and comforting that Tom didn't pull away. "She sounds like she was very special," Mary said. "She was," Tom agreed, "but she wouldn't have wanted me to spend the rest of my life sitting alone at this table, remembering." After breakfast, the children explored the cabin with the fearless curiosity of the young. They admired Buck through the window, begged to see Tom's axe, and declared his fireplace the best they had ever seen. Mary helped Tom clear the dishes, moving around his small kitchen like she had been doing it for years instead of minutes. "The children have taken quite a shine to you," she observed as they worked. "Johnny especially. He's been without a father figure for so long, and he's trying so hard to be the man of the family. But sometimes I think he just wants to be a boy." Tom watched Johnny showing Samuel how to stack wood properly, his young face serious with concentration. "He's a good boy," Tom said. "They all are. You've raised them well." Mary smiled, but there was sadness in it too. "I've done my best. But doing it alone, it's harder than I ever imagined." The admission hung between them, honest and vulnerable. Tom recognized it for what it was, not a complaint, but a simple statement of truth. He had been alone by choice, surrounded by silence he had cultivated. Mary had been alone by circumstance, struggling to fill all the roles her children needed while managing her own grief and fear. "You don't have to do it alone," Tom said, the words coming out before he could fully think them through. "I mean, if you ever need help. With the children, or with anything. I'm not going anywhere." Mary stopped drying the bowl in her hands and looked at him directly. "Are you sure about that?" she asked. "Because children form attachments quickly, and I won't have their hearts broken by someone who might change his mind when the novelty wears off." The question was fair, and Tom respected her for asking it. He thought about the past week, about the way his cabin had felt when the children visited, about how their laughter had filled corners that had been dark for too long. He thought about the soup they had brought him, about Lucy's careful folding of the bread cloth, about Samuel's trust and Johnny's quiet hunger for guidance. "I'm sure," he said. "I spent 7 years learning how to live alone. Maybe it's time I learned how to live with people again." The rest of the morning passed in easy companionship. Tom showed Johnny how to split kindling safely, taught Lucy about the different birds that visited his clearing, and let Samuel help him carry wood for the fire. Mary worked on mending one of Johnny's shirts, her needle flashing in the sunlight that streamed through the windows. It was the kind of morning Tom had forgotten could exist. Peaceful but full of life, quiet but not empty. The cabin seemed to expand to accommodate all of them, as if it had been waiting all these years for the right people to fill it properly. When it came time for them to leave, Tom found himself reluctant to let them go. The silence would return as soon as they walked out his door, and he wasn't sure he was ready for it anymore. "Will you come to dinner tomorrow night?" Mary asked as she bundled the children back into their coats. "It's Sunday, and I always make a big meal. There's plenty of room at our table." Tom looked at her, at the hope in her eyes and the way her children gathered around him like he was already part of their family. 7 years ago, he had closed himself off from this kind of invitation, this kind of connection. He had chosen safety over risk, solitude over the possibility of loss. But standing in his doorway, watching Mary Carson and her children prepare to walk back to town, Tom realized that safety was just another word for emptiness. "I'd like that," he said. "I'd like that very much." After they left, Tom stood in his cabin and looked around at the space that had sheltered him for so long. The table was clear again, the chairs pushed back into place. But something fundamental had changed. The silence didn't press against him anymore. Instead, it felt expectant, like it was just waiting for the next time voices would fill it. Tom walked to the window and watched the small figures making their way down the mountain path until they disappeared around the bend. Tomorrow, he would ride to town. Tomorrow, he would sit at Mary Carson's table and learn what it meant to be part of a family again. Not the family he had lost, but the family that had found him when he needed it most. Outside, the snow was beginning to melt, revealing patches of brown earth and the green promise of spring underneath. Tom smiled and began to plan what he would bring to dinner, maybe some of the preserves he had been saving, maybe some of the stories he had been keeping to himself, maybe just himself, which might be enough after all. As the sun climbed higher in the Montana sky, Tom McCready began to understand that some tables were meant to stay empty until the right people came along to fill them. And sometimes, if you were very lucky, those people found you when you had given up hope of ever belonging to anything again.